And you go on, and you see that essentially we were not in control. Her Majesty was still sovereign. So the issue of sovereignty, and maybe I'll stop there, the issue of sovereignty was the question. Sovereignty resides in who? Under the 1965 Constitution, sovereignty still resided in Her Majesty, who had a Governor General who, under the 1965 Constitution, became also part of the House of Representatives. If you say the House of if you have the Parliament constituted Her Majesty and the House of Representatives, and the Governor General could actually prorogue Parliament, and Cabinet was there to advise the Governor General. So essentially we said, under the 1965 Constitution, we are still a constitutional monarchy and not a republic.
Absolutely. And early on, yes, we talked about that. Yeah. And early on we said, yes, granted. Yet in 1965, was it October or November, when we went to the people to ask them whether they wanted a Republican status, they said no. That was what we were discussing when you came in. Yes, yes. And you were onto something there. Yes.
Some of the issues, the technical issues that Halifa raised, where some of these things, people considering the level of literacy at the time and the understanding of the dynamics between the leader of a country and the citizens was not clear. And so it was difficult it was rather easy for people like the PS Njais and the UP to convince people that it may not have been time yet to sort of, take full self-determination and decide the destiny of our own country. But that may have been one of the causes of the failure of the first attempt at independence, full Republican status. But 5 years down the line, we were able to see, by which time people's enlightenment and their awareness about political rights and responsibilities and freedoms and human rights had become perhaps a little clearer to the people, and it was then able to determine that indeed we are still ruled by a sovereign living in another country. Does that really give us full independence? He was ruling through a Governor General who was appointed and not elected by the people. How much of self-determination is that? And so these questions became very pertinent at the time. And that is why I believe, to a large extent, contributed to the success of the second attempt in 1970.
Absolutely. So, to you, Honorable, the 1965, the first attempt failed because people were not conscious, didn't understand what that meant. Yet we've heard from the historian Hazum Sisi, who said that people didn't trust. They trusted more being under the Queen. All their rights and civil liberties apparently were protected. So they were afraid that a Republican government would be a prelude to a dictatorship. It was quite interesting that we had PS Njai on one side, wasn't it? And there was Jawara on the other side. What do you make of that?
Well, I think historians just record the events and tell us how it developed and evolved. But a political economic approach will give you a different interpretation. 24, the British said that we were not educated enough, political thought was not mature enough. That is why they rejected the demand for elected representation. When Edward Francis Small was very mature, and eventually they pushed them, 1929 strike, 1930, they start giving elective representative in the council. By 1947, elective representative in the legislative council. This was out of the demand of a conscious Gambian people. If you follow the history, you will see that we did not attain all this on a silver platter. 1961, you all remember M.E. Jallo, the whole workers' union demanding for more wages. They had that strike, and in 1961 January, the colonial administration was so threatened that it had to see the union as the biggest threat to the colonial order. And of course, Jawara took the cue in March and decided, no, I will not accept PS Njai being the chief minister. So now we must move. And it led to constitutional discussion in 1962. So the whole evolution of the country was a conscious evolution from Edward Francis Small. What derailed the process is what my brother should say. that politics was no longer national. It became centered on individual interests. Once in 51, the parties emerged, Edward's foundation no longer mattered. The right to self-determination was no longer the issue.
What is then the nature of party politics?
And that's why I'm essentially saying the liberation theory of ensuring that you prepare a people to take charge of their destiny was actually imperiled by the new wave just to be there, to be seen, to have been a prime minister, a president, to a person in office. P.S. Njai, if he was left to be chief minister, would have wanted to move further into a republic. Any of them being in that position of authority would want to be the first president of the Gambia, I would tell you. But essentially, once one was there, the other also was struggling, and the struggle is between the parties and the individuals, not the struggle of a people for self-determination and independence.
Thank you. James, what do you make of that?
Yeah, I quite agree to what Mr. Sallah has said. What I understand
but
as well.
But isn't that the nature of party politics? You have different agendas.
Of course.
So some of them you may coordinate in some areas or cooperate in some areas and diverge in others. You know, divergence and confluence of ideas.
Like we saw with the independence negotiations and the Lancaster House, that it was the coming together of all political parties and actors at the time, including the Workers' Union, who went to Lancaster House to negotiate on independence. So here we have a situation where they were all together because they have a common agenda. Of course, when independence was attained and there was this continuing political struggle and tussle, as normal political parties would do, put arguments, and oppose or propose policies. And of course, this was a time when there was a favor, of course, for independence, and therefore people were, of a certain consciousness. But the political parties had different agendas, and one of the protagonists of this, political situation was, of course, P.S. Njai, who, as first minister, was then able to convince the people that it was still not right for our independence. I agree with Mr. Sallah that if it had been the flip side, he may have gone for full Republican status as early as Jawara tried. But of course, there was this continuing political struggle between, and that determined the positions that the political parties took. And that was the agenda they took to the people, to explain that either it is time in the case of Jawara, or it is not time in the case of P.S. Njai. Of course, there were a lot of other political underlinings. But key was what they took to the people and how the people responded. That determined the outcome of the first attempt. Well, I believe that after that, political understanding and awareness had gone to a different level. And in 1970, when it was attempted, people saw clearly that being ruled by a sovereign that resides in another country does not give us full independence. And this is how the arguments fall. Of course, there were a lot of other intricacies, the politics, the economy, and all those. But in essence, these were the questions that were put to the people at the referendum. Do you want full Republican status and self-determination, or don't you? And these were the polarized views that...
That's it. But then 24th of April 1970 happened, granted. But Honorable Sallah, in your book on republicanism, I think published in 2010, you said that we moved away from constitutional monarchy to elected monarchy. So what features of the 1970 Constitution led you to say that?
Yes, I believe this is what is key now to the discussion. The referendum of April 1970. What were the issues? A republic is where the people are sovereign, and self-determination is creating an economy where you build your raw material base, process them, and ensure that you move even towards building machines to be self-reliant. I am saying the issue was not about the sovereignty of the people in 1970 for the architects as well as those who were trying to derail the process. And because of that, What had happened was political cooptation between 1965 and 1970. You will see that Jawara was very sophisticated in terms of political cooptation. Many of the elements who opposed him, who had won in the regions, were being accepted in the PPP and given ministerial posts. So at the end of the day,
but didn't people show their sovereignty in their votes?
Well, we are agreeing on one fact, that the country had grown beyond constitution and monarchy. That's what I'm trying to emphasize. That people have started living with, you know, somebody who is there as prime minister. The colonial administration was no longer interested. Ghana had become a republic. Sierra Leone had become a Nigeria had become. Gambia was the last frontier to become independent, and the colonial administration, OAU, had come into being in 1963. So the whole architecture of the world had moved towards self-determination and independence. That's what I'm trying to emphasize. But essentially the missing point, and your question, is that people felt that we were just putting a precedent at the State House with the red carpets, with all the paraphernalia of monarchical existence, and that was the end. So essentially then, how to maintain power at that level and ensuring that you build a constituency that will support that power base, that became the objective of our republic. My position is that the republic should have been the byproduct of the sovereignty of a people being manifested in thought and in action. The first act should have been even evolving the constitution. The 1970 constitution was, how many Gambians knew what was in the 1970 constitution? Even those at the apex of public life never saw a constitution, never knew it. It was never taken to the people for any discussion. It was something drafted by an external power, handed over, and then started to be put into operation. That is why I am saying it was not our constitution. Many elements were there which gave us sovereign power. We never knew what was in there, and because of that, we didn't take ownership of that constitution.
Absolutely, but again, I have to say this, when you look around the world, most ordinary people really have never read their constitutions. Isn't it the case?
Well, yeah,
really, one. And secondly, the idea that, I think that's what Honorable Sallah is saying, that somehow politics, as it were, the imperatives, the shenanigans of politics, as it were, took over, hijacked the national imperative, the national concern that should have focused and concentrated minds. What do you make of that?
I entirely agree, and that is the legacy of that failure at that point are still being felt today. And the fact that we got it wrong at the very beginning is one thing that historians argue about and political commentators agree or disagree about. But the fact is, we were the improbable state, a country that does not have the wherewithal to take care of its own problems and challenges, and that we were being supported even at the early stages of independence by the British government in terms of amounts of subvention that was being given. I believe that at that point in time, at independence and the transition to republic, full republican status, politics had become, internal politicking, if you like, had become very, very prominent in this period of change and struggle. And Mr. Sallah referred to the co-optation of different words, and because people failed to understand that the PPP was a coming together at some point of very many prominent actors, the Ebinjais, the Jahumpas, and others who came and joined the PPP and were giving ministerial positions. So the fervor that led to independence had dissipated into some kind of political rivalry that had superseded the interest. And that's what Mr. Sallah is talking about the individual and collective sovereignty of the Gambian people. That it was good, we'll have the structures, we'll have the prime minister, in the case of after independence, the president, who is both head of state and head of government. So here we have the concentration of executive powers in individuals that lingered all the way to the 1997 situation. Many had argued that executive power that it was a very short order between the amount of powers vested in one person, but also the protections and the insulating him from accountability had become so powerful within the executive presidency, to the extent that it was a very short order between that and becoming a dictator. And that is perhaps why people were afraid that full Republican status would lead to dictatorship. But I believe we got it wrong. I believe the priorities of the time were shrouded or crowded or overcrowded by political maneuverings, and the people suffered as a result, because at the end, the constitution that we had referred, like Mr. Sallah said, to the sovereignty, but where was the sovereignty placed? That was the question. And I believe all the way to 2016, we had suffered, the people, in terms of our full entitlement as citizens, and what citizenship and responsibility is, and what is the dynamics between the people who elect their government and how that government should work exclusively in the interest of the people who put them there. That dynamics was lost at the beginning, and that led to our current situation.
But then, gentlemen, isn't that really the nature of democratic politics? There's something we inherited along the lines of what was happening in Britain. So there was this need, I mean, everybody talked about it, that everybody needed to sing from the same hymn sheet. It was right across Africa, wasn't it? That was why some states introduced one-party state. They wanted everybody to come together. Yet, that didn't work. I mean, democratic politics is messy. It's a mess.
Well, I think what you are doing, you are really interrogating exactly the process. What's the approach I would want to take is for us not to be passing judgment, but to see the evolutionary process of our growth in thought and in maturity, in political maturity, and what it will lead to tomorrow. They acted the way they acted because of their situation. But essentially what we must accept as the reality is that in 1970, a republic came into being without a sovereign people. Because the sovereign people should have been created out of that referendum for people to know we are now voting so that we will not longer have a monarchy. The person who is going to be there is going to be a representative. That person will be limited in power because the person will have to ask our consent. So authority must be derived from our consent. Authority must be exercised in our interest. I can guarantee you that if the campaign for the Republic was based on that throughout, you would have raised a conscious Gambian people who will not be voting for a P.S. Njai, a Jawara, or a Jessify, but a conscious Gambian people who are voting to ensure that authority is derived from them and is exercised in their interest. That would have built the democratic foundation that we still lack all over the continent, that you are lamenting that is this not politics? Yes, it is politics, because even at this very moment, we have not reached that level of democratic growth, the democracy of the Republic, the democracy that makes power to be owned by a people and exercised only on their behalf, in their interest. We have not reached there, and we must reach there.
Absolutely, but I'll have to ask this. Let me ask you, James. Don't you think that before we can reach that kind of democratic or political consciousness, wouldn't, for instance, education levels have to go up? Isn't that a much slower process, one might imagine?
Well, I mean, the question has been asked several times, I suspect, and I think that this question about the awareness level of the Gambian citizen at the advent of independence or Republican status was a determining factor of how people perceive politics and the relationships. Mr. Sallah is, is trying to draw us a picture of the actual processes, the reasons, as it were, why things happened the way they did. I'm trying to just give a broad picture of how it was at the time in terms of people's understanding. Look, Gambia has suffered, as so many other African countries, from the residual effects of feudalism. and we know these things happen, and that even now, our level of consciousness, you go around the country and you hear people tell you, they vote for individuals, they don't vote for programs and parties that represent the broad general socio-economic interests of the people. They are more, Gambians are more inclined to vote for individual political actors than for what their manifesto says they're going to do for the interests of the people. So these residual feudal issues still cloud our judgment, our politics, and the dynamics and relationships between the political parties, the political actors, and the people generally. So the question of sovereignty really, for me, is a constitutional question. Insofar as people have political sovereignty, we have now, since 1997, in fact, since 1970, the Constitution of 1970 may not have been drafted exclusively by Gambians, by the Gambian people. But now we had the opportunity in 1997 to do that. We did. We emphasized specifically and prominently on the question of sovereignty. In the very early openings of that constitution, that sovereignty lies in the people. And for us to understand that, it was the responsibility of governments to ensure that that practice is actually implemented, that it is taken away from the constitution and practicalized in terms of how you educate people, in terms of how you provide for individuals, in terms of how you bring them to the table of national decision making, where people are able to express their will and freely in a democracy. So the question of sovereignty still lingers. Where does it reside? We have seen very powerful presidents over the period here who didn't really care about constitutions, quite frankly, and was a law unto himself. That, again, is an example of the misplaced priorities. The dictatorship that we feared at the very beginning had manifested itself because the systems didn't prepare the people to understand where their powers lie and how much power they control in a democracy. So these are some of the things that would, create this problem this challenge that we have now, where people are still, quite frankly, in a very broad base, not aware of their own individual and collective power as citizens of the country.
Absolutely. Viewers and listeners on Radio, Q Radio 103.3, you are watching a live broadcast marking the country's 50th anniversary of our attainment of Republican status. I have in the studio two distinguished gentlemen, Honorable Halifa Sallah, the National Assembly member for Serekunda and the leader of PDOIS, and Mr. James Bahum, the social commentator. So I'll come to you. The question he threw up, I will give it to you. How do you practicalize sovereignty of the people? Do we need to bring in new institutions? How does it happen?
Well, yes, refer to the 1997 Constitution, which, of course, consulted but did not expand that consultation within an atmosphere where the people were sovereign. So therefore, they were restricted in their horizon in considering what a constitution was. But you've raised the question, wouldn't you need that literacy before you can build democracy? But is it not also very interesting that 1997 Constitution had an institution called National Council for Civic Education, which should have been given all the economic might to do precisely what you are saying. You can see that the ideas are there, but the intention is not there to implement them, because the interest still prevails, and that is the personal interest above national interest. That is really the dilemma. Essentially, if for 20-something years after the birth of the 1997 Constitution, you are still asking the question whether literacy has not reached a level political thought has not been able for democracy to be consolidated, it shows that the leadership at the highest level never had interest in strengthening those institutions to be able to empower the people. And that is precisely what must happen. Africa has grown, Gambia has grown. We have institutional failures, personal failures, failures of leadership. And you do not only attribute it to an individual. I must tell you, even those in the civil service, public service, in all sectors of governance, had always collaborated with individuals who may serve your personal interests. And because of that, we have dragged Gambia, the continent, into this quagmire of not having strong institutions, but also not having, you said, have strong institutions but not strong leaders. It's not about strong leaders, it's about leaders committed to democratic principles, leaders committed to constitutions, leaders committed to the interests of the people. You need that. You need those strong leaders, not strong in might to do whatever they want, that you call dictatorship, but resolve in clarity, resolve in respect for constitution, the rule of law, and serving their interests, not for all time, but restricting their powers so that they'll not become monarchs. That's why term limits are all part of the democratic process. So we are growing, the instruments are growing, but what is necessary is for each of us to know that we must all do what you are doing now, that we must not expect those in power to educate. The education now must be done by the citizenry at large. You need a citizenry that is ready to help each other to know what their rights are, what their powers are, and how to exercise them. And clearly, you don't need to go to Harvard University to be able to know those rights. I can tell you that in our own languages, if we educate our people to know that power belongs to them, and they should just simply entrust that to people who will serve them, and that becomes the culture. We nurture that, we will be able to build democracy.
But James here, how can the people wrest back that power away from the politicians, the politicking? How can people wrest back that power?
I think the growth of civil society organizations and civil society, the greater awareness within civil society, perhaps is a good prelude to the raising of awareness further, because the critical questions of democracy and rule of law and politics have been interrogated to, over generations, but there are peculiarities that differentiate between countries. In the Gambia, we have been part of a global empire whose educational systems were said to be the best. But we see that in the colonies, the way that they educated people at the time was geared towards exploitation, both human and material. But I am saying at this stage, currently where we are, the way to really take back that power and educate individuals, citizens, and communities around the world is being done by civil society organizations. It's been done by political parties. But we need a structured way of doing this. We have the Council for Civic Awareness and stuff like that. These are structures that were put in there to do a particular job. I suppose they are failing. That's why we're still here. But I think the growth of civil society would also help in doing that. The advocacy work that most civil society organizations are doing across the spectrum, from environmental awareness to political and civil, but also in the middle, socio-cultural. These are all things that people are educating. But I keep saying for many years that the reason our political process is in such a poor state is because of the lack or the failure, or if including civil society at the very apex of national decision making. The ability to entrust power, of course, but also the systems in place to ensure that accountability exists. And so these are some of the things that we have to really try and develop as we go along. In this new dispensation, there are no limitations to what Gambians can achieve. We have a new draft constitution that is, has been published. For us to now look at it in a way that would help us define our trajectory from here onwards. The people's, of course, it will be taken around the country, I suppose, as 1997 was done, but we must insist on certain basic values and of the relationship of the individual to government and how the individual citizens collectively, but also individually, must relate to government and what government's role is. These are things that we take for granted that we know, but in effect, looking at the way we still think in our very silo, myopic way of looking at politics. I'm not trying to just wipe everybody with a black brush or white brush, but I'm saying the lack of literacy, the lack of education at the very bottom of our system is really holding back our democratic advancement, and that needs to change. But civil society, as much as the political parties and government, will come together to agree on certain basic facts and take this country forward in terms of educating its people to understand the dynamics between government and the citizen.
Absolutely. But here, Honorable, I'll have to say this. The problems that we've diagnosed here, we've seen it the whole continent, haven't we? Over time, even go to Britain. For a long time, they said that, in fact, Northern England was the first colony of Britain, the working classes. In other words, for a long time, reformers, political reformers, would always fight the corner of the ordinary person, ever since. Yet, to me, it's beginning to seem as if what they want, the kind of reforms, how you want to bring down the leaders, I think it's sort of utopian. There are some people who call it utopian, that degree of popular participation, that degree of egalitarianism, perhaps that is a bit utopian. What do you make of that?
Well, we can only look at reality as it is, and the reality is that we became a monarchy and eventually became a republic. That a republic is a reality, and me and you will have our voter's card and we'll go vote. That is a reality. So we are not dealing with utopia. I do vote, you do vote, or you do have the power to vote, and we vote for people. That is power. The former president was there, who was more powerful than him. On the 2nd of December 2016, they say he's gone. So that is power. So we are not talking about utopian concepts. We are talking about real concepts. In fact, what is utopian is to believe that the people are not powerful. What is utopian is to believe that the people cannot reach a level of awareness where they know what their interest is and where they will go and vote for people who will serve their interests. I think we are dealing with two entities, the state and the people. And the state must be occupied by someone. So if you do not have people who are really committed to serve the people, then the people will distrust politics and they'll return to their shells. I agree with you. That is the situation in the world. But that is not a permanent situation because it's not leading us to development. It is not leading us to greater liberty. In fact, it is leading to greater poverty. So in essence then, that is not a state that is possible to maintain. And that's why we must now search for the type of situation that could be maintained. And that situation would require new leadership, maybe throughout the world, where those leaders will be there for the interest of the people, and it'll come in two ways. One, consciously, people seeing that they need to serve society and they devote themselves to serving society and they are trusted. Or the people will start putting people and removing them ad infinitum until some sees that, well, since I cannot be there by being dishonest, then I will try to be honest so that I'll be there. So I'm simply saying that this is an interesting period of world history, where we see the democratic movement is no longer talking about Soviet Union and this, the wall and etc. It is now people knowing that they need liberty, they need prosperity, and they cannot get it until they demand for it. And the demand is increasing. Who will answer to that demand? I think will increasingly become the focal point of Gambian politics and world politics. Who will be able to address the demand of the people? And I believe that the demand is going to be more vociferous, and essentially some will be there to answer that demand. So I have hope for the future.
Absolutely. And James, yes, I mean, the world has changed. That bipolar, east, west, it's all gone now. So we're having to redraw the fault lines. And particularly now with the coronavirus, most African countries now, it hasn't really spiraled out of control as we've seen in other countries. But again, we are becoming exposed to weak health systems, all the games that we were playing. Now we're faced with an existential threat that has really exposed really the paucity of their performance in many ways. Indeed,
and I think if we just hop back for a little bit to 1970, 24th of April, which we are celebrating today, we'll find out that we'll ask the question then, how self-determined were we? Where were we in 1970 to create a better standard of living, to create a better Gambia, to create a responsive government and a sovereign people? Where did we go wrong? Where did we lose all that favor that led to 1970? I would say that we were a bit overwhelmed, perhaps, by the trappings of government, and the priority was for power and power for itself. And that is perhaps why we fail to see that our hospitals, our schools, our workers, people who get up every day to eke out a living, were supposed to be the priorities. But the trappings of government, the desire for personal and individual power, extend that to clan power and all that. This question of why do people wake up to go and vote? Is it for the individual or for the country and a party that will represent their interests? And these are some of the questions that, is all over social media. From last year, I followed these questions, these arguments, and these discussions. I believe that what we need to do at this stage in Gambia, given we are still in this change agenda from 2016 to now, is to call for a national dialogue of all sectors of the country and the people. The Gambia needs to sit down and have a big conversation. We have now seen the weakness and the failure of investment in the right sectors of government that would uplift the lives of the people. Education, health, these are the two key areas in which just demonstrate the utter failure of our governments over the period. Now we are scrambling around. People are trying to come together into collectives to help the process, to ensure that we, one, mitigate corona, contain the virus, ensure that the people live healthy. But it does not fail to direct our attention to the fact that the reason why we are all up in arms, as it were now, we're looking at a hospital and health infrastructure that is very weak and fragile, and we are afraid it may not be able to help us in this corona system.
So thank you very much. We've come really, they keep telling me time, we've come to the end of the program really. So the new draft constitution, let's hope there, sovereignty taken back to the people?
Well, I think it's very clear that the corona has brought everybody together again to see the importance of self-determination, all borders closed. A constitution is an instrument. We're not discussing about it. We're not debating about it. Civil societies are not moving about educating people about the constitution. It's like political parties are beginning to look at the constitution. What can I derive from it and how does it serve me? Gambia is undecided. We were told that Gambia was decided on the 2nd of December 2016, and today an instrument is there. Have we really decided? We have not. So, but the healthy thing is me and you, him, being able to sit down and talk to our people. And the conversation is what is necessary. Yes, national dialogue, but what I see, the Gambia I see, schism. Everybody has already taken a poll. They have built their parties. Even the president has built a party, even though the original objective was a transitional issue. So really we have still the parties of the 1960s, 70s, and they will come, they will appeal to the people. But I hope underneath all this, with the corona, each of us will sit back and ask ourselves the question, have we achieved the aim for which the Gambian people struggled since the era of Edward Francis Small, in order to ensure that we become sovereign, and by sovereignty residing in us, that we exercise that sovereignty to have leaders who will serve our interests, that power for no other purpose but to serve the public interest. Have we reached there? No. Should we think about it? Yes. Should this be the occasion now for each of us to take stock? Yes. And I think if we do that, this anniversary will have meaning as we wish it to have meaning.
Thank you very much on this Republic Day. That's food for thought. And for today, everybody will come together and mark the occasion. Thank you very much, gentlemen, Mr. James Bahum and Honorable Halifa Sallah, for joining us on QTV today to mark the country's 50th anniversary of attaining Republican status. And thank you very much, viewers, for joining us, and listeners, because we've been on Q Radio as well. Until next time, thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.